Welcome to Dwell on These Things, a podcast by Dwell Community Church in Columbus, Ohio, where we hear stories and examples of how God is moving in the church at Dwell and around the world.
Hey, Dwell on These Things listeners. I'm Patrick Reeder, Director of Equipping here at Dwell Community Church. With me today is Sam Chan, author and speaker. Welcome.
Hey, Pat, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, we're really glad to have you here, especially given the long trip you had. So I thought I'd start off kind of light. Having lived in the U.S. and Australia, what's best when it comes to the flushing toilet? Apparently in Australia, it goes one way, clockwise, I believe, and here it goes counterclockwise. Which one do you think is better?
Oh, wow. You know, that got made famous by a Simpsons episode, and I'm not sure it's actually true that they flush clockwise or anti-clockwise. And we know the American system just goes, vroom. It's not like it swirls. But I will say this, they're actually totally different plumbing systems, having lived in both countries. And the American system, I don't know what it is, blocks a lot more. And that's why when you go to America, there's always a plunger next to you because you're going to need a plunger, not if, but when. So
Wow.
I don't know what it is about the American system, but it definitely blocks for no reason.
Wow, that's disappointing to hear from our standpoint, but maybe we should ask your plumbers.
Yeah, you put a
what they
man
do.
on the moon,
Yeah.
but your toilet systems still block.
Yeah, that's right. Actually, when I was trying to figure out a goofy question, I did discover that this was a complete hoax, but I still think it's a funny question
It
to
is a
ask.
funny question.
I was like, does this have to do with the Coriolis effect and, the
Wow.
spinning of the earth? And it's like, no, it doesn't. It's water is that, say like a massive tidal pool or a hurricane or something might churn in different directions depending
That's
on
right.
which part of the world you're in, but toilets, it doesn't do that. So, you work for City Bible Forum in Australia, and I was wondering if you could tell us, especially listeners who maybe aren't familiar with that, tell us a little bit about the City Bible Forum, what the ministry is there, and what's your part there.
Sure. So with City Bible Forum, what we try to do is we network Christian workers with each other. So it's Christian ministry in the workplace. So we get Christian workers to network with each other, and we then equip and encourage them to tell their friends in the workplace about Jesus. So I guess what makes it sort of unique from other workplace ministries is other workplace ministries would encourage Christian workers that also do the faith in work sort of thing where there's value in your work in and of itself. They also might organise events where there are opportunities for evangelism. But where we go, the next step is we equip Christians to tell their own friends about Jesus in the workplace.
Great.
And we all have different roles. So my role is to be that guy that speaks at an event if you organise an event. So they can be events at Easter or Christmas time or even workplace events where we talk about ethics or success or validation.
Okay, great. So to clarify, you're saying that essentially a primary role of City Bible Forum is to equip individual workers to do personal evangelism, but that you show up at key events and maybe give a presentation and help people, basically kind of stir up interest.
Yeah, that's right. So there's both ground up in that the workers for themselves tell their friends about Jesus, but also a top-down approach where maybe a gifted speaker comes and speaks at an event, and that's my role, to be a speaker. And something interesting is the events come through two different avenues. One can be Christians in the workplace, form a little in-house Christian group, and then they invite me to speak in that group. And the numbers will be small, but I'm allowed to say anything I want.
Right.
The workers might ask the organisation, hey, is it okay if we organise an Easter or Christmas event and we have a Christian speaker giving Christian content? The organisation, the company will say, sure, because it's your own group.
Right.
It's like if you have an origami society or a cooking society, do whatever you want. But the other avenues you come in through, I think you guys call it the D&I, diversity, inclusiveness. So you come under the company's official umbrella of D&I,
Wow.
where you say, hey, as people of faith, can we put on a faith event? And the D&I branch will say, yes, of course you can, but it has to come under company guidelines.
Got
and the
it.
advantage is now you can use official company overhead, advertise on the bulletins. But then when I come and speak, then you got to know the D&I representatives are in the back room listening to what you say. So now you have to make sure you don't say anything that offends, a broader community. So the advantage of the D&I one is your numbers will be big, you can advertise, but your message has to be a little less pointed, just much more ecumenical. The other one is your numbers will be small, harder to promote, but you can be a bit sharper in your message. And I say it's a bit like in China, you have the official church, run by the government, where your numbers will be big, but the government's monitoring what you say, or you can have the unofficial church where you meet in small numbers and you can be, no one's going to hassle you for what you say.
Right. I'm guessing probably in China, the official church is probably a little bit more restrictive than the professional class of Australia. But I mean, but it's that's an interesting comparison there. And I like how what you're describing here overall is just a diversity of strategies or a plurality of strategies, just kind of hitting at all different angles, both training the worker and using more than one type of venue, through the official channels or not so official, just with the Christians and, more free to say what you like. But I think that approach, the sort of hitting all different kinds of approaches is, I think, a great way to go, and not just sort of having a one and only one strategy. So I read somewhere that you have a background in medicine. Is that right?
Yes.
So what led you from medicine into, say, working for City Bible Forum, or even, I guess, going to Trinity Evangelical when you did that?
Yeah, it wasn't a deliberate, instantaneous decision. It was definitely a slow journey. And I like to explain there are many ways you can serve God as a medical doctor. So one example is my brother is a hand surgeon, and through his surgery, that's his way of worshiping God, bringing God's justice and mercy and love into this world through his operation, bringing excellence and healing. Another way is my dad, who was a radiologist, where he pretty controlled hours between Monday and Friday, but they gave him the financial freedom to serve his local church in a variety of leadership levels. But then for me, I felt I had a calling from God to go into a public proclamation sort of ministry because I had opportunities to speak and preach the gospel in a way I couldn't do if I kept doing full-time medicine. Because full-time medicine, the demands of the hours meant you're not free to speak at youth camps. You're not free to do a variety of proclamation ministry. So then I realized, you know what, I'm going to have to give up full-time medicine and go into Christian ministry for those reasons.
That's cool. Yeah, we my father-in-law actually works for a ministry in Cambodia called Mercy Medical Center, where they kind of blend the two, which maybe sounds a little closer to what your dad was doing, where it's, of course they're managing an entire hospital, but he uses my father-in-law uses the medicine to kind of, it helps people in the community, and yet at the same time when people are present, they have a staff, the Cambodian staff, that then proclaims the gospel to visitors who are interested. So it's cool to see the way that these can all kind of work together, and kind of the variety of examples you gave there. One of the things that I think when people talk about the post-Christian West is a lot of the conversation focuses primarily on the obstacles. What are we everything's going, towards darkness. Things are getting worse, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I guess I'd like to ask instead, rather than, what are the sort of unique obstacles created by, say, an environment like the secular Australia or secular United States, what are some unique opportunities that exist for sharing Christ in those environments?
Yes, so Mark Sayers, he's a pastor, podcaster, author in Melbourne, Australia. He says it's not so much we're post-Christian now, we're actually post-secular. Because it's almost like the tide has turned on secularism, because secularism promised us if we just had better education, better government, better science, the juggernaut of progress is inevitable. But suddenly we've had a pandemic, we've got a land-based war in Europe, and you realize we don't have all the answers anymore.
Right.
And he says it's like the tide of secularism has gone so far out, the sheer weight of the gospel is going to come rushing back in. And I think we're seeing it. There are opportunities. So I have a friend who's in college ministry, and I said, what's college ministry like right now? She said, it's amazing. We're seeing so many people turn to the gospel. And I said, well, what's going on? She says, so many reasons. One reason is people looking for purpose and meaning. They turn up to college knowing what they're free from. They're free from the authority of parents and teachers, but they don't know what they're free for.
That's awesome.
And so there's this hunger, this thirst for meaning and purpose and direction. And then she says a lot of other people are turning to the gospel because they're wanting freedom from anxiety. Somehow in the Western world, even though we're materially blessed, like we live longer, we own more things, we have free Wi-Fi and McDonald's, but somehow we're disproportionately stressed, anxious, and depressed. So what's going on? So people are turning to the gospel because they want freedom from anxiety, knowing that, if there's no God, we have to be in control of everything. Or the universe is not in control at all.
Right.
But if we know there's a God in control, that frees us up to not have to be in control of everything. So there's a freedom from anxiety that the gospel offers. And then she also said many people turn to the gospel because they're just wanting a way to live, some sort of structure, some sort of discipline, rituals or good habits. And because right now they're this free-floating vacuum, you're told to do whatever it takes to be happy, but you don't know, what does that look like? What does that mean? And people are saying the mantra that you got to do what it takes to be happy has become a curse for this generation because they're forever saying, but I'm not happy. That means I'm at fault. Or they're saying, am I happy yet? Am I happy yet? And I heard one lady being interviewed by National Public Radio saying, for our parents, they got told to be successful and, that was horrible. But at least they knew when they had a job, a car or a house. We got told to be happy and that's just making us miserable. We're exhausted just trying to be happy. So I think people are just wanting, I just want peace. Maybe where can I find peace instead of being happy? And I'm tracking what's happening in the United Kingdom. And they often say they're like 10 years ahead of the USA. They're even more post-secular, more secular, but now they're even more post-secular. So there's a podcaster called Glenn Scrivener. He's interviewing Ayam Hirsi Ali. She was an atheist. She was one of the new atheists. She was a poster child for the new atheists. Her story was she was originally from Africa, originally from very fundamentalist Islamic backgrounds, turned to atheism as a relief from that, was almost a poster child for Richard Dawkins. Look, this is someone who's turned from religious fundamentalism and embraced atheism. Well, she's now become a Christian.
That's
and
funny.
she says, because atheism gave me nothing.
Yeah.
There was no meaning. If I'm just atoms and molecules, well, what does that mean? That means I have no mind, I have no self, I have no identity, I have no purpose, I have no meaning. So she's embraced the Christian faith. She's only
fantastic.
a new convert. But I think if I'm feeling the vibe correctly, people are sensing that secularism has not delivered what it promised.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. I really liked your emphasis on freedom. That, and something I'm working on privately on the book of Job, I've been thinking a lot about this nature of freedom and how there's an obsession with absolute freedom and liberating us from every single thing. But then when you cut all those things away, what's left? It's just you. You're just alone. And it's like, it's not exactly joyful or encouraging, or, you sit there wondering like, well, when am I going to be happy, as you put it? One of the things, so we have a decent sized, you mentioned college ministry. We have a decent sized student in college ministry here in this church. And I guess I was wondering, thinking about young Christians, people who are coming to faith now for the first time, or, maybe they grew up in a Christian home, but they're trying to figure out what is it like to live live their life as a Christian believer in this world, which maybe looks different than their parents' world. What would be one piece, or maybe a couple if you feel like it, piece of advice that you might give to Christians, kind of in the college and high school age range.
Yeah, I know it sounds obvious, but no matter where we are in our Christian journey, day 1 or day 100, it all begins with grace.
Yeah.
Knowing that it's not me, it's not my works, it's not my effort, it's not my good works. It begins with grace. It begins
That's
with
great.
God and what God has done for me and what God gives me. And I think the 3 fundamental needs of any human person,
Yeah.
I call it the Holy Trinity, is you need to know you're seen, you're loved, and you're safe. You're seen, you're loved, you're safe. And as a parent, I read a lot of parenting books. They said if you want your child to thrive, they need to know they're seen by you, loved by you, and they're relationally safe, as well as psychologically, physically safe. But relationally, they're safe. You will be there for them. You love them, and you see them. That's a Holy Trinity. And from there, you thrive. You have the freedom to be excellent and the permission to fail at the same time.
Yeah.
So once you begin with that unconditional love, then that's the foundation you move from. And I think in our Christian journey, it begins with that same foundation. You're seen, you're loved, and you're relationally safe in God. And from there, you have the freedom to be excellent, be everything God wants you to be, but permission to fail. There's a God who forgives you, and there's a God who fulfills you. And then having begun with that, what I'm starting to see now is, okay, you're saved. Okay, but now what?
Yeah.
And that's often the problem with those evangelism tracks. Okay, I'm saved, but now what?
Yep.
And I'm starting to. I think there's a movement now within Christianity, and I think it's a good movement, that spiritual formation is a good thing.
Yeah.
I think like 20 years ago we said, it's legalism. You're saved. You don't need that stuff. But now we say, yes, I do. I need to work on. Mark Sayers calls it your private hidden spaces, and
Jesus's prayer closet. As he calls it.
That's right. And he even says Jesus began with 40 days in the desert. Why? Because he was working on his private hidden spaces. And from there, he was able to launch into public ministry. So who we are in public will often reflect how we've been working on our private hidden spaces. So then we need good habits, good rituals, good patterns. So for me, I'm not prescribing this because that will be legalism. I've just had, so for other people it would be different. But for me, I said, my good habit is, what's the first thing I do in the morning? Am I turning my phone on? Am I logging in to my computer? No, my first thing before I touch a device and again, this shows how it's not spiritual. I'll have a coffee. I'll have a black coffee. That's my ritual. I'll boil some water and make myself a coffee. Make that my first ritual. Yeah. And then I'll read the Bible. Yeah. And then everyone will have their different system. I'm working through the Bible in 1 Year program. Then I'll text a friend, say, hey, what did you think of today's reading? Yeah. And just to keep each other accountable, but just ask safe questions out loud. Hey, what's the deal with this? I don't understand it. Yeah, me neither. And just leave it at that. And then just listen to a 5-minute worship song and then do some physical exercise. So that's my little habit ritual. Yeah. But then I'm a father with kids, and we've made our ritual no matter what. When we jump in the car, we just take turns praying. We go praying in a circle. Even if we're just driving to the shops, even if we're just driving to school, even if we're driving to sports. So that's one little ritual. And at dinner time, we check on each other's emotions. What made you happy today? What made you sad? What made you angry? What made you sorry? What made you surprised? So learning emotional literacy. So just stuff like that.
Yeah, I really like the point you're making about good habits. I think you're right that there's a temptation maybe because, I say like in the United States, I don't know what this is like in Australia, but, there was sort of a post-war generation and there's kind of a very rigid feeling in the household. And I think that there was, this sort of countercultural movement of the 60s that sort of was like threw a lot of that to the wind. And it's like, I think some of us are kind of coming back and being like, there was some stuff that we did back home or, maybe that our grandparents did with our parents that actually wasn't that bad of an idea. Maybe we should try that in our household or something like that. And, not because, God's staring down with his arms crossed or maybe he's a general or something like that, thinking of the war imagery, it's like making sure you go through your drill, but because, wow, actually this is good for me. And, I'm a human, I have, a body, and I think that, just it can be very tempting to just sort of think that like, oh, habits or rituals, that's silly business. It's like, no, we have muscle memory, we have, neurosystems, a lot of these have to be taken care of. So yeah, I think that's helpful. I really also, of course, for the younger generation, just getting oriented around grace. And I think that's really essential. And just the way that some of these, say a habit or a ritual or whatever, flows out of being loved rather than trying to gain love, say.
Yeah, so if I can just take that a little bit further.
Please.
So the secular world, interestingly, has discovered this cry for good habits, good rituals. So there's a book by Charles Duhigg, The Power of Habit, Jocko, and then all these books put out by...
Atomic Habits.
Yeah, that's right. And there are all these books put out by ex-US Navy SEALs and special ops people. Like there's some admiral who's got a book called Make Your Bed, and you got Jocko Willink, Discipline Equals Freedom. You got David Goggins, I think Master Your Mind or something. I can't remember the exact title. So the world is actually hungering for good habits.
Yeah.
And even Jordan Peterson, 12 Rules for Life.
Yep.
So this lady in college ministry was saying she's noticing a lot of secular college students are discovering, that's the appeal of Jocko Willink, David Goggins, Jordan Peterson. They actually want good rituals, good habits in their lives. But if they don't begin with grace, they will break down. And even Jordan Peterson himself a few years ago spiraled out of, he couldn't control his body, or he's ended up with some addiction. I think he's come out of it. So it shows habits by themselves aren't enough.
Right.
It has to begin with grace. And just last week I spoke at a crew ski camp to teenagers, and there was a teenager spoke to me afterwards, and he wasn't a believer, but I spoke on the parable of the prodigal son, but I spoke in this talk about the older brother who had good habits, good rituals. Look, he says to his father, I've been slaving away every day for you. So he's the disciplined, delayed gratification person. And he was angry and bitter. And I said, that's what it's like if you don't begin with grace.
That's
and
great.
This teenager said to me, oh my gosh, you have just described to me the last 12 months of my life.
Wow.
Because he tried to get disciplined about fitness. He tried to get disciplined about his study habits. And he just burnt out after 12 months. And he said he was angry. He was bitter.
Yeah.
And I said, yeah, because it has to begin with grace. You need to know you're seen, you're loved, and you're safe.
Yeah.
You have to begin from there. You need to begin
story.
with Jesus first. Otherwise, the disciplines will burn you out and make you angry and bitter.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really interesting anecdote. Thanks for sharing that. A really helpful anecdote. A few days ago, I was reading in the book of 1 Kings, and I turned 40 a couple of years ago, and so I guess I'm noticing things in the Bible that didn't pop out to me before. So, it's familiar that Solomon, the king, lost his way to his wives, and we reread, okay, Solomon started wise and then lost his way, but I had never noticed before that in 1 Kings 11:4, I'll just read this. It says, as Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God as the heart of David his father had been. And it struck me, the part about growing old really stood out to me, that it, for whatever reason, just because I was reading quickly, also because I wasn't, when I've read before, I'm just not really thinking about my age that much. But, as I've gotten older, I'm like a little bit more aware of my mortality. And so that really stood out to me, that it was Solomon's aging that caught up with him. And I was just curious, we just talked about the young. I was curious, do you have another piece of advice? I mean, certainly you couldn't go too bad if you just went right back to the grace advice. But what would you say to the folks who've been walking with Christ for years, who have maybe even seen some real ministry success, led friends to Christ, done some discipleship work, taught Bible studies, and so on and so forth? In other words, they lived not quite like Solomon, but they started strong like Solomon, but then there's another 30, 40, 50 years of life ahead of them. Do you have any input or thoughts on that?
I love how you brought up David and Solomon, because like you, I stumbled upon these passages only recently. I've been going through that Bible in 1 year program.
Yeah.
And we've just been going through Samuel and Kings the last month. And every year I too pick up on things I didn't notice the year before. And this year I noticed several things from David and Solomon. They both didn't age well. At a formal level, they're these salvation historical heroes from the Old Testament.
Absolutely.
But at a material level, when you read the verses, both David and Solomon did not age well. They did not end well. Their hearts drifted away. And as someone said with Solomon, I can't remember how many wives and concubines he had, but someone said he didn't get them overnight in one day.
Right.
He drifted into this. Just like you can build up good habits, slowly you can start building up bad habits. So he drifted away. He just took one thing, which led to another thing, which led to another thing. So it was a gradual drift. It wasn't a binary, hey, great yesterday, not so good today. He gradually drifted away.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing I picked up was there's a verse there that says God only spoke directly to Solomon twice.
Yeah.
So, often we say, oh, why can't God speak to me like he spoke to the great pillar in the Old Testament?
Right.
Well, he actually did not speak directly that many times. So Solomon's sort of prayer devotional life with God is very similar to ours. It would have been where you've sort of just got to intuit the voice of God rather than hear it directly.
Right.
So maybe what I then can say in answer to your question now after a big preface was a few years ago I read a book by David Brooks, New York Times author, wasn't a Christian back then, but he called it the second mountain. And he talks about how in the first half of your life, we climb the first mountain where we serve the needs of the ego. Yeah. And we do it by looking for trophies, success, validation. Then you climb that mountain and you realize there's nothing here. And then you realize, there's a second mountain I should have been climbing. And we usually discover this when we've climbed the first mountain by the age of 35 or 40.
Yeah.
And there's a second mountain, and that's where you serve the needs of the soul. And you do this by giving rather than gaining.
Fascinating.
And it's through sacrifice and service to others. And then he actually thought, if this is true, and he thought it was true, it can only be true if behind this universe there's a giving, sacrificing God.
Wow.
That's why there's a second mountain.
Yeah.
And that journeyed him into Christianity. So he became a Christian through that discovery. And we too can make the same discovery that, okay, it's actually about giving. And I actually I work part-time as a medical doctor.
Yeah.
And I often assist surgeons. And I see how they've climbed that first mountain and their lives fall apart. And I then talked to someone in college ministry. He put it to me this way. As a boy, it's all about winning, gaining, and who has the most toys.
Yeah.
But to be a man, you have to realize I'm actually here to die. I'm not here to gain. I'm here to give and to die. And until you die, you will not become a man. You'll stay a boy. So then I told him about this surgeon who's always bragging about how many cases he's done this week and how he's done more cases than any other case. His marriage has fallen apart, but it says, I'm dating again. I met someone on Tinder and I'm doing to get back at my wife. And I said this to this guy in college ministry and he said, oh my gosh, your surgeon's still a boy.
Yeah.
He thinks it's about winning.
Yeah.
He has not realized he's here to die. He's still not a man. And that means as a man in every facet of life, family, friends, church, work, once you realize, I'm actually here to serve and not gain, then you become a man.
That's fascinating. It really reminds me of when Peter confronts Jesus after discovering he's going to the cross and he says, never, Lord. He can't understand the possibility that the Messiah would be crucified. And it's like, immediately after that, Jesus goes into the teaching about you must pick up your cross and follow me daily. It's that imagery of death, the dying to self, the pouring out, the giving is deeply biblical and a hard lesson. Even Peter the Rock is stumbling badly over this message. Yeah, so I'm also curious. We have a very large volunteer base in our church. We're we're looking. We have our deacons. We call our servant team. We kind of translate diakonos rather than transliterate it, right? But deacon, servant, whatever. So that's kind of and we're looking at about I think we have just shy of 800 people on that group. People who are leading home churches, people who are doing discipleship work. And, our staff is not that large, especially people specifically in pastoral work, So we're looking at approximately, anywhere from 650 to 750 volunteers, depending on how you're counting. And so I guess I wanted to ask, you've already been talking about habit, which is excellent, but I guess I was curious if you had recommendations for, how can someone who really wants to serve Christ, but they're a volunteer, they've got family, crying babies at home, they've got a job, do you just have any input or wisdom on like what does it look like to be a dedicated Christian servant from the long haul, but not just sort of neglecting the family? You hear some of these unfortunate stories about like Billy Graham. I read this story about one of his sons at age of 2 saw him and was like, "Who's that?" And just so you have some of these stories like that, and you're like, we don't want to be that way. We don't want to be the King Davids or the King Solomons, who have similar, family problems. I just wonder if you have any insight or input for sort of that group, people who are like, we're in, we want to serve, but we're bumping into the 40 to 60-hour work week. We're running into the demands of the household. And what kind of input do you have for that group?
Oh, wow. There's so many strands
That's
there
a lot of juggling.
to tease out. I think part of it is it's in our DNA to want to serve. Let's call it for what it is. If the God of this universe is a giving, serving God, and we're the image of God, we too want to give and serve as much as we can. And that's why we might catch ourselves over functioning when it comes to service, and because that's just how we're wired. I also say, church, when you first come to church, it's like going to someone's house. Yeah. It's not your home yet. So you're in the living room. It's very courteous. But then sooner or later, your church becomes your home. So you find yourself in the kitchen cooking, cleaning dishes and doing the laundry. And that's when your church has become your home. Yeah. Because you do find yourself on rosters. Right. Because that's just what you do if it was your home. My boys unstack the dishwasher in the morning. Right. If I turn up to church, I do expect to find myself on an audio, video roster or something. It's your home church. But at the same time, you're juggling these demands of stages of life. And I know people... someone called Michael Graham from the Tim Keller Center says when it comes to choosing what to do, he called it look at your character. So again, are you beginning from grace? Am I doing this because I'm loved? Or am I doing it to be loved, which would be the wrong thing? Am I doing it because I'm already seen by Jesus? Or am I doing it to be seen? Okay, so that's a wrong motive. So what's your character? What's your motive? What's the chemistry? Like who do you get on well with? What's your competency? Like, don't put me on the music team if I can't sing in tune, but maybe put me on a different team. What's your capacity? Was the big one. And I think that's your question. That's good. I know in parenting books, when I read a book by Stephen Biddulph on raising boys, so I'm not sure how the dynamic goes with raising daughters, but he says, as a father raising boys from 0 to 4, your boys look to the mother for leadership. So your role as a father is really just to change. Read the bedtime stories, do the bath, do the changing of diapers. But from 4 to 14, they look to the father for leadership. 14 onwards, they look to some other male role model for leadership. Wow. And 18, they'll come back. But then the point was from 4 to 14, Stephen Biddulph says that's not the time to take the promotion, the book tour. Fascinating. And interestingly, I know church planters, they say the same thing. If your child's 0 to 4, you can try to plant a church. 14 onwards, you can try to change city and plant a church. But don't change cities and plant a church if your children are between 4 and 14. Wow. A lot of church planting organizations say that. All that to say... Interesting. Capacity and context do make a difference. So suddenly if your parents are aging or your children need you, maybe this is the time to step back and just put yourself in a less demanding roster than a very demanding roster.
Yeah, that's interesting. I really, I've heard, we talk about character, of course, very important. You look at things like 1 Timothy 3, Titus 1, there's these character qualifications, expectations on people, whether for elders or for deacons or, we're looking to see people's character ideally, but I like just kind of these C's that you gave, what was it again? So you have a context, chemistry, character,
capacity. And Michael Graham throws in a fifth one, which doesn't start with C, force multiplier. Where would you be a force multiplier? So even if there's you, how does this create this domino effect that even there's even more output than as if just one person joined the team?
That's cool. All right. Well, thanks, Sam, for joining us here at the Xenos Summer Institute and coming and joining us on the podcast. For the listeners, if you want to get more from San Chan, check out some of his books at our bookstore during the Summer Institute. Of course, you can find them in other, normal outlets like Amazon. And for more for XSI this year and for things for Dwell Community Church, you can visit dwellcc.org. Thanks.
Thanks, Pat.